welcome everyone who's joining us online, offline, through streaming and wherever else. I am delighted to have with me today Brandolon, Barnett and Meg Massey, and we'll be talking about the topics that we're typically going into with OXIFIED, which is the Oxford Initiative for Inspiring Entrepreneurial Diversity, which is the intersection of social impact, impact investing, social entrepreneurship with key factors of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm delighted to have with me today Brandolon Barnett, who's an innovator, author, entrepreneur, who builds and leads products, initiatives, and partnerships that bring together tech and social impact. He's currently the Chief Product Officer at Deed, a Y Combinator-backed ESG company, also the leader of Democratized Ventures, and his previous work includes roles as the head of corporate social responsibility industry solutions within Salesforce, as well as the leader of Grow Fund. So a really strong ESG and CSR background. At the same time, we have Meg Massey, who's a writer and strategist committed to democratizing the conversation about finance and social impact. She's the co-author of Letting Go: How Philanthropists and Impact Investors Can Do More Good by Giving Up Control. She's the founder of Sans Per, a strategic communications agency that works with impact investors, and she previously held roles at the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment, Monitor Deloitte, and the Obama White House. So thank you, Meg, and thank you, Brandolon. I'd like you all to also open with a little bit more about your experience and your vantage point, including your work currently and most recently working alongside different kinds of impact investors, ESG actors in the ecosystem in regards to this question. What is your 30,000-foot view on the state of diversity, inclusion, and representation in the sector? So Brandolon, this would be more from an ESG side, and Meg, this would be more from an impact side. Specifically from a funding perspective, what is your 30,000-foot view based on all of the players that you currently work with and have been working with in the recent past? I'll open it up to either one of you that wants to start.
I'll let you take this one first, Meg.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to be here today. As Tara said, my name is Meg Massey, and I've been working in the social sector, primarily on impact investing, for more than a decade. And one thing that became very clear to me very early on in that space was that finance writ large is still very white and very male, and there's a lot of language that is designed to make it feel clubby and exclusionary. And a lot of the early conversations about impact investing were about the what of impact investing, what you could invest in that would generate impact, whether environmental or social. And there was very little about the how of impact investing and how it could be different than traditional finance. And the how gets at a lot of questions about the need for systemic change in a lot of our systems, including finance. And that was what inspired me to write my book, Letting Go, where my co-author and I looked at examples of funders, both in philanthropy and impact investing, who are finding ways to cede power to the communities that they ultimately wanted to support and making them part of the conversation. And we found during our research and our own experience, and wrote about it in the book, that there are two main cases to be made for embracing this outlook. One is a straightforward business case that engaging different perspectives, diversity, equity, inclusion writ large. There's a really compelling business case for that. McKinsey has released a study recently that puts those numbers in black and white. But beyond diversity, it's also a question of accountability and if you're only accountable to a small group of people on your investment committee or to your shareholders, you're not whatever engagement you do with your community is with the communities that you're trying to serve ends up being it ends up being a little bit more like consulting or listening, as opposed to helping people become active participants. And that brings us to the moral case that a system designed to be top down, designed to be exclusionary, that's ripe for change. And we're starting to see impact investors rethink not just what they're investing in, but how they're going about it and how they're bringing those voices in the room. And that trend was present before the pandemic and before the uprisings in the summer of 2020, which my co-author and I concluded had accelerated progress, but we still have a long way to go. However, this question, I think, is now getting some of the attention that it deserves, and we hope to see that continue.
Yeah, and I want to also join Megan in thanking the audience, the audience as well as Tara. I'm excited for this conversation today. And, when I think about the 30,000-foot view of DEI in the ESG space, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is just the sheer amount of dollars flooding into ESG. So 2021 was a record year for ESG. By some measures, 25% of all the funds invested in the US went into ESG funds. $120 billion, that's up from $51 billion just a year before. With all that money coming in, what I think about very often is that there are kind of two layers to ESG. There's the funding layer, which we of course want to touch on today, but there's also the layer of ESG practice within companies like the ones that I regularly work with through consulting or through the technologies that we build at Deed, and previously I was building at Salesforce. And on the funding side, you think about that, all of that money flooding into ESG funds. What does that mean for small businesses, for example? What does that mean for minority-owned businesses geographically dispersed throughout the world? And so the funding picture has changed, driven in part by the social justice movements that Meg referenced. Really, ESG efforts became responsive to, well, how do we, and I think about what we saw at Salesforce, for example, how do we take funds that may have traditionally been given out as philanthropic grants and think about our ESG impacts through our support for minority-owned businesses in our communities? That's something that JP Morgan has done. I saw that shift internally at Salesforce. And you can even think about technologies that surface that companies made it a priority to build during the pandemic, specifically in response to social justice movements, where they thought about, well, if we want to move funding to minority-owned businesses, say, for example, Uber and Uber Eats, we need to surface and find a way to make it clear to end users that this is a minority-owned business that you're supporting and that you're moving dollars to. So there's that realm of ESG kind of infusion of funds into communities and then there's the realm of all the funds that are coming from these big investors. How do we think about how diverse actors get access to that funding, how they participate in that growing ecosystem? And then there's another aspect of diversity and inclusion in the ESG space, which is the diversity of those who are leading ESG efforts and corporate responsibility efforts within companies. And there's not a lot of diversity there, but that of course becomes part of the picture as well. So there sort of a kind of a rambling answer there, but there are really three dimensions that you have to examine very closely when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion within the ESG or corporate responsibility space.
I think it's such a good point, and I want to highlight this for the MBA students that are joining. See, a lot of MBA students that are joining now or that will listen to the call later want to go in careers into impact investing because it seems like the perfect channel to make a difference. But we need to be aware of the full picture and the potential negative externalities. So to give a really interesting example, for years, a lot of impact capital was going into microfinance, specifically in South Asia. But in the past few years, I've been asked to take safeguarding training. And one of the biggest safeguarding risks, one of the biggest negative externalities that was coming up in the case studies, which wasn't initially profiled by impact investors, is the fact that domestic violence rates were skyrocketing in certain countries and communities as women became more financially empowered. So you're selling impact reports, which promote all of this positive good, thousands of women receiving microfinance and creating jobs. And it's such a rosy picture of the impact. But if you don't have the 360-degree view of any negative externalities, you could be doing more harm than good. So it's a huge contradiction that any aspiring practitioner needs to be aware of, not to mention the fact that as inequality rises, it creates systemic risks. And the damages to infrastructure and real estate and buildings due to things like the uprisings, whether in the US or even more recently in South Africa, both of which stem from inequality, affected financial returns. And how are we capturing that? And then that goes back to the case of the fact that these investments are supposed to have financial returns, independent of those externalities. So this is the reason why I thought it was so important to bring you all together and share these two sides, the ESG and the impact investment philanthropy side, all of which are growing by leaps and bounds. One thing that we didn't touch on is, why is this the case? So you gave your 30,000 foot view. Why is this the case? And what do you see as being the major barriers to reaching full diversity, inclusion, and representation in the sector? And I think this time we can switch the order.
Yeah, I'll jump in. And I think my answer to this question around what are the barriers to DEI and ESG is a bit nuanced. So I referenced earlier, there's ESG practices that we have to think about. There's ESG staff, who's actually doing the work, leading companies' ESG reporting, the practices that feed into those corporate responsibility or sustainability or ESG reports, and then access to the outcomes of all of that activity. So where do the grants go? The thing that elucidates for me is that it kind of matches a trend that I've seen in the ESG space over the last 5 years in particular, which is that diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI, used to be something that was incredibly siloed within organizations. You might have a VP of diversity, equity, inclusion. Salesforce was one of the first companies to hire a chief diversity officer, for example. And that person typically just kind of sat in a silo, did their work alone, often with a small team, somewhat limited resources, perhaps a strong mandate from leadership. But the shift that I've seen in the ESG space, and it's true for DEI, but also for other elements of ESG, as all of that money has flooded in, it's increased the complexity of doing the work and made teams within companies want to collaborate more closely. And that's included the diversity, equity, inclusion function. So now what you see more frequently is that every leader within an organization and every person acting is being asked to think about diversity, equity, inclusion. It's not just your hiring, it's also your sustainability efforts. So to the point that you make, Tara, it's that all of these, there's kind of this increasing realization that I've seen when talking to customers or building product especially, that all of these ways that we hope to drive impact are really closely intertwined and interconnected. So that when you're thinking about your sustainability as part of your ESG strategy, you also need to think about environmental justice and what impacts your efforts are having to stem more environmentally sustainable initiatives, products, et cetera. What impact is that having on communities of disadvantaged people or communities of color, especially in the US if you're operating here, but also abroad or throughout the world, wherever you may be operating. And so to me, that silo remains a barrier, but I see a trend where it's going away, where there's increasing collaboration, increasing pressure for everyone to think about DEI. And a lot of that's being driven by the fact that DEI is a major part of ESG reporting frameworks, like the SASB framework or GRI and others. And so that's one piece. The other big barrier I see, and I highlighted in a piece I wrote for the Chronicle of Philanthropy last year, is just awareness. If we want to increase diversity, equity, inclusion in the space of corporate responsibility and ESG, there are too many communities who just don't even know what ESG means. They don't know what corporate responsibility is. And it's hard to build a diverse pipeline of candidates, for example, if you're trying to address the staff issue and diversity there. If you have whole communities, particularly communities of color or disadvantaged communities who don't even know that there's this thing called ESG, that there's this thing called corporate responsibility that they can have careers in and meaningfully engage with in a variety of different ways. And so awareness that this work is happening is a big barrier. And it was something that I experienced in my own story, and kind of big part of the topic of my book was just a journey to figure out how I could have a career in impact, and learning that there was this space of companies trying to drive impact through enhancing their operations, improving the way they engage and treat their employees, thinking about the diversity of their teams or the impact of their operations on the environment, on the climate change and other major issues. And so for me, awakening to that awareness created so many opportunities for me, both professionally, but also personally, to find purpose in life. And I think it's a big barrier that there are so few people who've been able to reach that understanding.
And Meg?
Yes, Brandolon, I completely agree that we're seeing a move away from the siloing of ESG and DEI in this space, which is really useful because those things should be interrelated. One trend, I do think it's helpful to go back a little bit and look at the kind of the root of that siloing, because it's endemic to the history of philanthropy and modern day markets. The modern philanthropy, and I'm speaking particularly in the US, although I know there are similar trends in the UK, around the turn of the last century, you had a bunch of new billionaires, the John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, who made a ton of money in what were new industries at the time, railroads, electricity, that sort of thing. There weren't any regulations, and they were able to make massive amounts of money very, very quickly. And Andrew Carnegie in particular, he wrote a book saying that the goal was to make as much money as possible in the market and then donate it to causes. So from get, there was this siphoning off of, there's what you do in the markets, and then there's what you do with philanthropy. And the relationship was, if our foundation does something good, maybe people won't look as closely at how we're making profits in the markets. And there's a lot that's changed in the last 100 years. We now have labor laws, for one, but we also see history repeating itself a little bit in that, and we've never really gotten away from this idea of a very top down. There's one person, almost always a white man, who makes a ton of money and then gets to decide how it's invested. And on the one hand, yes, it's your money, do what you want with it, but it gives so much power to single individuals who are often very limited in the types of experience that they have. And so how do you bring other voices in? It's not just that we think you should be investing in different causes or making grants to different organizations. It's that thinking about a process that doesn't assume that just because you are a billionaire that you are now all-knowing and have some sort of omnipotent power to decide what works and what doesn't. And it's also a question of valuing different types of experiences. One thing that's particular to diversity, equity, and inclusion is we've seen this push to build the pipeline of talented women, people of color, to take on roles at investment firms, to become entrepreneurs, and all of that is great, but it values a very specific type of experience, from getting an undergraduate degree and then an MBA and then spending 10 years on Wall Street. There's a very set path, and some people some people follow that path and learn what they need to know and do great things. But if that is the experience of every single person who is making the best investment decisions that affect millions or billions of people, that level of homogeneity is a problem. And we have seen some examples. A lot of today's billionaires made their money in tech, and they might do a great job running a tech company, but we're starting to see Mackenzie Scott is a really good example of someone who's starting to recognize that she has all this money and she wants to take a step back and let the people working on these issues take the lead, which is really, really heartening to see. And so I think a barrier there is just, again, valuing those different types of experience, that there are many ways to learn how to make investment decisions, how to conduct due diligence, how to think about your deal flow and where you're sourcing projects from, that get out of the bubble that, again, tends to be very white, very male, very Western, from the same 3 universities, focusing on the same networks, and broaden it out. And as Brandolon said, there's a very strong business case for this, but this is also a way of course correcting, the origin story for this approach itself, right? This idea of the one person who then gets to play God.
And just to jump in there, what I think is really interesting about that is we're kind of seeing within this, the space of social impact, right? In which I would include impact investing. I would include ESG. It's this idea that, impact needs to be a part of everyday decision-making in a variety of different means, or different ways rather. And what we're seeing is really interesting to me in the sense that this idea that you can crowdsource products and technology, that by bringing together the crowd, by listening to all of your users, listening to all of your stakeholders, you can build a better business, build a better product. Diversity, equity, inclusion to me is really us saying as a society, hey, we can build insert a lot of things, better policies, better companies, better investment portfolios by listening to diverse voices. And I think it's really interesting that that trend kind of mirrors a broader trend that we've seen, whether it's in product development or in crowdsourced initiatives, viral movements, driving a lot of what's successful in marketing and advertising. And it's all driven and supported by technology, but it's a broader movement that we can see in ESG and impact investing through participatory grant making of the kind that Meg and Ben through their book have advocated for. I just think it's an interesting parallel there.
I think that's a really interesting point, Meg, when you made the point about what happens to impact investing when you have one profile of person who spends 10 years on Wall Street, has this geographic expertise, this educational background, et cetera. What happens to impact investing? And there is a shift towards that profile, as it becomes more mainstream with the broader financial sector. What happens to origination? What happens to pipeline? What happens to your awareness of social considerations? And when you said it, I was like, she should tweet that. But it's slightly depressing. But it's slightly depressing. It makes you lose a little bit of faith. In the same token, to hear Brandolon follow up with this encouraging point about the phenomena of crowdsourcing and how not through any type of impact-related ethos, it is taken when and become mainstream also. It gives hope that actually, as our generation continues to take control of the financial sector, the corporate world, basically take over running the world, that there's hope for us to do it in a more representative and inclusive way. And we already are on the path to doing it in a more representative and inclusive way than our parents' generation has done.
Absolutely.
As you all know, for a lot of the impact circuit and the ecosystem, the SDGs are central, and that's particularly when it's linked to donor or development finance, which is an ecosystem in which I'm quite active. How does this link? How does diversity, equity, inclusion link to the other SDGs outside of SDG 10, which is the SDG or the UN Sustainable Development Goal for equality in and of itself?
That's a great question. And I think, ultimately, when taken in whole, the SDGs are advocating, they're laying the groundwork for really wholesale systems change. And I think to your point about being optimistic about the direction that impact investing is going in, I think we're already starting to see that. When I was introduced to this world when I worked on public-private partnerships in the Obama White House, and this was like 2011, 2012, and the conversation was so focused on, we swear if you invest for impact, there will be returns, we promise. It was so focused on proving the point that we don't need to change anything about this system. It's just gonna it's just gonna be this extra goodie that gets added on. And that has really given way in the last, I would say, 5 years to a much bigger conversation about, okay, what impact are we having? Is that positive or negative? And how, okay, rather than simply becoming, yes, we want to normalize impact investing, but can we start untangling the how a little bit, how it gets done, what are some of the norms in our financial systems that really do need to change because they're outdated, because they don't reflect the direction that the world is going in. and that affects the the environment. It affects democratic institutions. It affects education and children. There's all of those things. The way that the way that we function as a society is that the economy and financial systems shape pretty much every decision. There's a symbiotic relationship, and so I think that bringing in that commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, it has ripple effects, because women, I'm not my only experience with being a woman is not, well, I've been in places where there aren't any women, right? If you're a person of color, you're not only an expert on race, you also have your wealth of knowledge, your wealth of experience that goes well beyond simply, I can only talk about these issues. And so when you have a more diverse group of people with a more diverse group of experiences and perspectives on everything from education to the environment to democracy, you're inevitably going to get the energy that's required to really do some transformative work.
Yeah, totally agree. And in the ESG space, I would say diversity and inclusion have become a lens. So, and what I mean by that is, no matter what you're doing as part of your ESG efforts, and I mentioned earlier the ESG frameworks. So some of the more popular ones that I have seen among customers. So for example, last year, I led a product strategy team at Salesforce that looked at corporate responsibility and sustainability reports for over 100 of our customers of our Philanthropy Cloud platform. And what we noticed throughout that work was that previously, again, there had been silos. But diversity, equity, inclusion, and sustainability and well-being in particular have become lenses through which every aspect of the organization's work is viewed and measured. So that if you take the SASB framework, I'd say the two most popular are SASB, as I mentioned, and GRI. Although CDP is growing in popularity, they're
I think we might be having a technical problem.
Working with a client, Fortune 500 customer, and they came to us and said, we want to use CRM to be able to house a database of our 20,000 suppliers and find a tool that can tell us which of them are minority-owned businesses, and then use that to drive strategies for how we engage with those businesses. Whether it's helping them to build capacity, which can mean finding funds within our grant-making portfolio to give to organizations in those communities that help minority-owned businesses with advisory services, with loans, whatever they need to build their capacity. Or we could simply band together as employees to volunteer doing skills-based work with these entrepreneurs to help them build their businesses. But it all started from viewing their supply chain through the lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, much like they've been encouraged to do for their sustainability efforts. And the same can be said for the SDGs. No matter if you're looking at zero hunger, if you look at that through a lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, you ask yourself, are our efforts reaching everyone in the way that they need to? If you think about clean water and sanitation, here in the United States, it's difficult to separate that from issues of diversity and inclusion highlighted in places like Flint, Michigan, where you've seen that certain communities of color have disadvantaged access to clean water and sanitary facilities. And then you see things like decent work and economic growth, or affordable and clean energy, where in both cases, you're thinking about new jobs that can be created for new people. Can we make sure that there's a diverse pipeline of people who could take advantage of all of those new innovations and subsequent new opportunities to engage with our economies? And then I think one of the more interesting aspects is around environmental justice, which I think is going to be a topic of increasing concern as we continue to grapple with how we tackle climate change. And in particular, the history of the environmental movement has not been very inclusive, whether that's within the ESG space or elsewhere. And so there's an increasing realization that hopefully the solutions we come up with for, say, waste management are more are more considerate to the impact on communities of color. Because if you think about what actually happened for much of the recycling movement, a lot of the things we thought we were recycling were ending up in landfills, mostly in communities of color, or ending up getting shipped off to China. And so everyone's patting themselves on the back. But as you break down silos, say within an organization that's thinking through the lens of DEI and how they deal with their supply chain, how they deal with sustainability and waste management, you have to ask yourselves questions like, where are the things we say we're recycling as an organization actually ending up? Who's being negatively impacted by that potentially? And that comes from just applying the lens of diversity and inclusion to every aspect of your work that you're engaging in the ESG space.
That is such a brilliant and profound example. And I've also heard and seen how many of our recycled products end up in Africa, where likewise, there's not the infrastructure facilities to then do anything with them. And it just further compounds the fact that a lot of the countries in Africa are the most vulnerable to climate change. So it just goes back to the point of understanding the potential for these negative externalities. And that's why, as much as it's been cool to be on the impact investment side, I'm quite heartened by the growth of ESG, because ESG is looking at the risk, whereas impact investing typically is just more looking at the benefits. And I'm hoping that the push for everyone to adopt ESG will then force people to be more aware of the risk of these externalities, especially with the advent of mandatory reporting. You guys have been on all sides of this ecosystem collectively. And so I'd love to hear your take on who is doing this well on the ESG and impact investment side, any of their successes, any of their learnings, even if the learnings actually have come from failures.
I'll let you start this, Meg.
Okay.
Which I think has worked.
Yeah. There are a few examples that we highlight in Letting Go, and two of which I think are particularly good examples here. One is Village Capital, where my co-author Ben Roble, he works there, and their model is they do a model known as peer selected investment, where they gather cohorts of entrepreneurs who are working on a specific sector in a specific region, like fintech in West Africa. They bring them together for an accelerator program, entrepreneur support program, and that cohort, at the end of the session, they vote on who in their cohort should receive seed funding from the investment arm of their organization, and they honor whatever the cohort decides. And a study with Emory University, I believe 2017 or 2018, found that their portfolio was more than 50% female-led companies, that it was performing, as well, if not better than, similar portfolios in the market. So what I like about their model is that, there's data behind it. So people who love data get very excited about it. But also it really, really rethinks the idea of expertise. The people at Village Capital are great, but they also know that these are entrepreneurs. If you are launching a company, then you know your market, and you're trying to find the best way to develop a product that meets the market, come up with a strategy to scale, and you're having to really draw on your knowledge of both the sector and the area where you're from, and the area where presumably you would be launching this product. And so it's a way of drawing on that expertise rather than maybe including those elements in a due diligence process. It's making it the centerpiece of saying the people who know this market are the people who should be making decisions. So that's one example. Another example, which was one of our favorites, we were able to visit this organization before the pandemic started, when we were first working on the book, is the Boston Ujima Fund. And they are a democratic investment fund in a group of neighborhoods in Boston that are primarily working class people of color. And the way that they have structured their fund is that they take investments from people all over the Boston area. Their residents of that area can invest for as little as $50. They also take much bigger checks from investors elsewhere in the city who are writing, $50,000, $100,000 checks. And then the residents can join the fund as members, and they vote on which businesses receive their money. So it's an economic development fund for those neighborhoods, and which structurally makes a lot of sense. The way that their fund manager put it to us is, if the residents say, hey, we really need a grocery store that sells fresh produce, if they're then able to invest in that business, presumably they are then going to patronize that business and it's going to do well. It's pretty straightforward. But what they did, which I haven't seen as much of in some of these models and am eager to see more of, is that they've really tackled this question of equity and building wealth. So the net worth of a Black person in the Boston area is $7. The net worth of a white person is in the hundreds of thousands. Like that's obscene. It's absolutely obscene. And there's a legacy that all these historical drivers, but fixing that isn't just about creating opportunities to get a job and earn money. It's also about creating opportunities to really build wealth. And what the Ujima Fund has done is created what's called an inverted capital stack. So I mentioned that some residents invest for $50. If you are a low income person, $50 is actually kind of risky for you. It's a more significant percentage of your income than if you're a millionaire investing $50,000. It's those residents who are actually taking on a bigger risk. So when returns are made on the Ujima Fund's investments, the first people to get paid back are those residents, are first to earn returns and interest, so that they can actually start building wealth. And again, the logic makes sense. The returns are supposed to go primarily to the person perceived to have taken the most risk, which usually has been whoever gave the most money. But when you think about that as a percentage of income, yeah, these residents are taking a much bigger risk with their $50, $100, whatever, than someone who, basically prints money for a living. And the investors who write those larger checks, like they will get returns eventually, but they have to go in knowing that they're not in charge of this, and really trust the residents that they know what sort of businesses they want in their community. And this is still a very small fund, and they made their first investment in 2020. So there's not a huge track record to point to yet. Having said that, their first investment was in a mobile composting company. They invested in like a week before the pandemic started. And suddenly mobile composting, because people were inside and businesses were having to shift their models, it actually ended up doing pretty well during the pandemic. So they recently made their second round of investments. And again, I tend to get really excited about this model because I love it. We're still waiting for the numbers to bear it out. But this idea of rethinking risk and rethinking building wealth, this is a really great example that I hope other funds are able to see.
That is so transformative. I literally got chills from the story. Brandolon, I don't know if you can top that.
I don't think so, because it's a little bit harder for me to identify some shareable examples at times from among, because I have relationships with customers and clients of the platforms that I build that mean that I can't always talk about their successes and failures in the way I might like. Some of the things I've seen that have been really interesting, though, are just the growth of what are called affinity groups or employee resource groups or business resource groups within companies, which are groups of employees who are like-minded, either in terms of a shared identity that they want to affiliate with. So it could be a group for African-American employees, or for APAC employees within a company, or for European employees, or for employees who care about the arts or the environment. The growth of those has really opened up the space of ESG practice. And you said something was said earlier that I think is very interesting, and it's the idea that ESG is only about avoiding negative consequences or reporting. I think that that's an interesting statement that I always try to push back on, because for me, I separate ESG into it's just a measure, it's an accounting standard, a set of accounting standards. ESG is driven by practices that fall under the realm of practice that's been emerging the last 20 to 30 years of corporate responsibility. So within a company, you have corporate responsibility professionals or other professionals working in HR or other parts of the organization who are all doing work on the ground that then ends up feeding into that ESG accounting framework. And what's interesting to me is that those individuals doing the actual work of ESG are able to find partners who are engaged within their community, within their company of diverse employees through these affinity groups or these employee resource groups. And I have seen that partnership be very robust, particularly at companies like Airbnb, which is one of our customers at Deed, who use our product to engage their employees. And so the growth of those groups, I think, is really valuable in that it's creating a pipeline, or I'm not sure the exact word I'm looking for. It creates a venue for the kind of participatory processes for making decisions around what we're going to do as part of our ESG strategy. It makes that a part of how companies are doing business. And that's been very interesting to see. And I've even been on calls with customers or prospects where the head of corporate responsibility is on the call, along with a few of the employee resource group leaders. And then you think about 2 years ago, LinkedIn announced that they, of course, part of Microsoft, that they're actually starting to pay those employee resource group leads so that they're doing this work off the side of their desk, and in recognition of the value it's providing to helping the company drive their ESG strategies, they're compensating them for the work that they're doing. So I think that's been a very interesting thing to see, and that's an incredible practice that I'd like to see more companies adopt. I also think that one of the big lessons that we need to take from the pandemic and from particularly the response to social justice movements is just this idea that the ESG and corporate responsibility space just represent, by nature of their existence, but also is something we could dig deeper into, is this idea that impact is no longer the domain of foundations and charities and nonprofits exclusively. It now includes social enterprises. It now includes B Corp. It includes minority-owned businesses and how supporting them can help build wealth in communities and drive a wholly different a new generation of philanthropists who are bringing this perspective because they have it as part of their lived experience, but also just helping us to rethink what impact really means. And so I've really been heartened by some of the initiatives. I was able to work on one with Sean Combs last year and Combs Enterprises, where they built a platform
Brandolon, we're not hearing you very well. Do you want to turn off your video momentarily?
Circulate, that's going to launch sometime. Yes, I can certainly do that. Hopefully that's a little better. I'm seeing that my internet is unstable. But let me know if you're still having issues hearing me. But I would say that you can or can't?
We can.
Okay, great. So I would say those are some of the examples that have really stood out to me. I would say in terms of failures, I won't be specific, but the biggest failure I've seen is when there's a slide back into rooms where you're talking about issues related to impact, whether that's your impact investing, which a lot of companies are getting into that space as well through kind of impact funds as part of their venture portfolios, or you're talking about ESG, how you're addressing sustainability. And when it becomes kind of a cause celeb for whoever is in leadership within an organization, I would say whenever I see that, just know that it's a failure as a business practice. You are not going to build effective ESG strategies. You're not going to build effective sustainability programs, impact investment portfolios, if your room is just the billionaire CEO kind of making calls based on of what products you're going to build, how you're going to address issues based on their issue of the month. That's a failure I've seen too often in the ESG space.
Just to echo that, Brandolon, one thing that I was finding working, my work is strategic communications in my day job, and following the murder of George Floyd, when there were, you had a lot of companies tweeting a Black Lives Matter, tweeting or releasing statements, and myself and others who work in that space were finding that these investment funds or companies were saying, okay, we've put out the statement, we're supportive, now what? And then when they find out that it's more than just one meeting or one announcement or one that it really is like really truly embracing social justice and diversity, equity, inclusion is not just a one-step thing, but a multi-step thing. To their credit, a lot of companies did step up and say, okay, we're going to do this. Some didn't, which is unfortunate, but all of them, I think that realization can sometimes slow progress in ways that are unfortunate, but it's also good to see that you have companies that took that as a moment to, okay, we actually should rethink a lot of what we're doing.
I have further questions because, as you all know, as part of OXIFIED, we're building a toolkit on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the impact startup ecosystem. However, before I ask those questions, I think it's only fair to turn it over to any of our attendees, students or beyond, and get their questions in, because if I need to, I can always come back to you with my questions. So I'll just give anyone an opportunity to raise their hand and join in. Otherwise, I will ask my outstanding questions. Okay, that's fine. I will ask them. So as mentioned, we'd like to use, actually we do have a question from Henry Obispo, who's asking, where do you see the impact of DAOs going? Donor advised, well, I'll
distributed autonomous organizations, I believe. It's driven by, it's kind of distributed or shared ownership driven by crypto. I think it's fascinating, and I don't know to what extent we want to get into a crypto conversation here. We've got 10 minutes left, and a lot of folks I know are still trying to wrap their heads around what it means. But I would say, whether it's DAOs or DAOs or other crypto investments, I think what's getting, what gets me excited is that they hold the potential to diversify and democratize the act of ownership. Specifically, when you think about, let's think about the example of a cryptocurrency that, let's say, a set of actors or institutions, say as part of their ESG efforts, agreed to accept for payment for a certain set of services. And let's say that when this coin first debuts or has an initial coin offering, you give every African-American person in a city or region some seed coin. And then as the coin is distributed and used on that network, it grows in value. You then are creating an opportunity. Let's say it's used for the purchase of marijuana as it continues to be legalized. Then you've created an avenue where, as people are engaging with this economy, people from marginalized groups are able to have their wealth grow in kind of new and innovative ways. And then you have ownership, in a sense, over that economy that is being formed. It's kind of difficult to explain, but I think that is the potential of crypto to democratize access to capital, or democratize the creation of capital in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of schadenfreude that we're seeing in that space, but I do think it's fascinating to think about. And just to have one more thing, what's really interesting to think about with DAOs in particular, so there are these groups where individuals can vote on what they want to fund. In a lot of ways, a DAO is just a crypto-powered version of a giving circle, which have exploded in popularity. There are something like 10 times more giving circles now than there were 4 years ago. And I worked on some of those issues to promote giving circles when I was leading a Gates-funded initiative called Grow Fund. And it's fascinating to see the parallels between things like giving circles or participatory grant making and some of the processes that are developing around crypto.
That is so exciting, and I hope it leads to further conversations about where that can go. Meg, do you have any comment on that as well?
I also, don't feel like I can confidently speak on crypto. I'm still educating myself, but to the point, giving circles is something that giving circles and participatory grant making, which, just in brief, it's when get a group of people together, they each make it, put in some money, and then they decide, on some sort of recurring schedule how, where and how they're going to give it. We've been giving 50% of the profits from the proceeds of Letting Go to the Decolonizing Wealth Project, which is led by Edgar Villanueva. And that uses Grapevine, which is basically a giving circle platform that lets you kind of form one formally. So if that's of interest to you, definitely check out Grapevine and Decolonizing Wealth Project. And with regard to participatory grant making, I mean, the process there, as with investing, it's simply bringing those voices into investment committee decisions, due diligence, deal flow, in this case, grant making applications. And to the extent that that blockchain and crypto further those goals, I think that's great. I know that there's been a lot of chatter in the space about what this means, but it's all sort of part of this bigger question of, what kind of economy are we really trying to create, and seeing blockchain as the means to an end rather than the end itself.
Before I give closing remarks, as I mentioned, we're working on a toolkit, and I hope you all don't mind if I may be so bold to ask that some of this video be used for the toolkit for OXIFIED. So with that, if you could give each of you what you believe is one of the most important practices that social enterprises or impact investors need to consider when it comes to diversity, equity, representation. And that can be whether it's for human resources, whether it's for supply chain, procurement, governance, whatever you think is the most solidly etched in your mind as a best practice that you think needs to be promoted. That's what we'd like to have you share with us, and then include for the OXIFIED community, if you're up for it. Otherwise, the video will just not be used for the toolkit.
I'm certainly open to that, and I can jump in with some of the best practices I've seen and some of what we're doing at Deed. So I'm the Chief Product Officer, and the first thing I think about when you're a social enterprise or an organization thinking about diversity and inclusion, it is a lens, and it is best practice for everyone in the organization to be cognizant of the fact that they should be thinking about those issues as they think about their hiring decisions. But most importantly of all, product. If you're a business, your number one product is your product. And so we think very often at Deed about how we can use our product to drive more inclusivity. And that leads to functionality that we build on the platform. So I mentioned earlier those employee resource groups or business resource groups or affinity groups. They're called different things within companies, but we've built functionality to support that within our platform. So roles that are specially tailored to the leaders of those groups to be able to create content, share their work, and get others in the organization excited. And then also you have to think about inclusivity of access to your product. So for example, we think very deeply about, we built a Slack integration last year. And so we're thinking very deeply around where are users? There are single moms who are too busy to log into platform number 6,844, that's part of their workplace technology stack. How do we then surface opportunities for them to give, connect to causes, all the things our platform supports where they are? So if they're just going about their everyday business in Slack or in Teams or in other tools, how can we create a kind of purpose layer? That in and of itself makes our product more inclusive. But the practices I point to that I try to think of very closely are, one, just awareness. We all need to talk about we all need to be having these conversations in new places and in front of new groups of stakeholders. So I've made a concerted effort with the release of my book to try to go talk to high school students in minority communities about work and social impact technology, impact investing, things that nobody bothers to tell them about. And then in doing that, you're creating essentially an expanded pool, a pipeline of candidates from those diverse communities who know about the work that you're doing, and then have an opportunity to engage with it. And then the other thing I'd say is, some people say that it's an issue, kind of a first world problem or the equivalent of unpaid internships. But the unfortunate truth is that a lot of the ways to engage with work for someone trying to get into this space involve unpaid work. And we need to move away from that. We need to understand and recognize that if we really want diversity, there are people who can't afford to not have health insurance, to not get paychecks, but still can be an asset in doing impactful work. And so it becomes very important to provide pay to the people you're trying to bring in and train and lift up. And then the last practice that I really try to stress as I build out my product team, and I've seen this successfully in the past, is just being very transparent. You know, if someone on my team wants a promotion to senior director or director of product, VP of product, I provide transparency into what the responsibilities are and the expectations are at each level, so that people know transparently what they're aiming for, and it's not just a sort of situation where I happen to know the hiring manager or the person who's in charge of approving promotions. Rather, there's transparency around what is the expectation for me to move from one level to the next, and what's the expectation of leadership, that so that I can also hold them accountable. That kind of transparency is key to me.
And Meg?
So on the funding side, whether as a investment fund or as a philanthropist, one thing that one best practice I would say is simply consulting the ladder of participation, which is it's a framework that was developed in the 1960s. There's a whole fun history that I will skip over. But basically, it's asking yourself the question of when you are engaging different voices, you know, when you're being intentional about that, are you doing it in a way that is meaningful? So the bottom rungs on the ladder are non-participation, when we're doing a thing and we don't really care what you have to think or say. There's no feedback mechanism. And then there's the middle ground, the middle rungs are called consulting. And this is where I think a lot of funders are doing this in good faith can sometimes fall flat, where this is when you're asking for feedback, you're having a listening session, you put out a survey. So there is a way for people to participate, but it's not clear to them if or how their comments will be used. The example I always give is, you know, when you get like a customer service feedback form, you know, if you don't think it's going to actually change anything at the at the place that's providing the service, you're probably not going to be either not filled out at all or not be very thoughtful about the way you do it. Whereas if you know that, you know, this is exactly how this is going to be taken into account and how we will use this information, that knowledge and that transparency drives much more meaningful engagement. And into the top rungs on the ladder, which are called, the framework calls them citizen power, but it's basically where, you know, the group of people that you're, instead of just listening to them, they have a vote on a committee, they are able to make recommendations for a vote. They have a meaningful role to play, and that has been made very clear to them that this is the power that you have, and this is how what you share will be used. And so as funders and companies think about DEI and really integrating everything into their, you know, getting it out of those silos, which is the trend that, you know, both Brandolon and I spoke to, that it's starting to become more endemic throughout these organizations, which is a good thing. I think the top thing to keep in mind is just, are you just in consulting mode, or are you really in a shifting power mode and really trying to change things? You know, and I think that's really important to keep in mind as a best practice.
Very fascinating conversation. I feel like we've just scratched the surface. I wish that we had, as opposed to just a fireside chat on the thinking side, that we could have it with another layer on the doing side, but maybe that's something that we'll come back to in future conversations or another future engagement. I just wanted to thank you all for joining today. Thanks to everyone in the audience. Thanks to those who will be watching online later. You can find more information about OXIFIED on the OXIFIED website, which is in the chat, through the School Center, and of course about our speakers. Feel free to put your LinkedIn's and your company websites in the chat, and we'll also share them on LinkedIn as well. And thank you all for joining, always improving, progressing, onward forever, forward forever, backward never, right? Thank you
Yes,
all.
thank you. This is wonderful.
Yep. Thank you so much. This was terrific.